sorry.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about Mark's resurrection story is there's really three endings to his gospel. It's believed that the original, again, Mark was the first of the gospels written. The actual gospel written ended at verse 8. And then later, someone else added either the longer ending, which is verses 9 to 20, or that shorter ending that comes at the very end. But putting an ending on the gospel other than kind of leaving it open-ended the way verse 8 does. So let's look at, first of all, kind of concentrate on the assumption that the original gospel really ended with verse 8. And then we'll discuss a little bit about the other two endings that were added later. And there in the commentary it says, once again, as the women who attended to Jesus' need, the same women who had ministered to him while in Galilee. The only name that is consistent in the four gospel accounts of the empty tomb is Mary Magdalene. Talked about there in the gospel passage. But she encounters someone at the grave. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a white robe, and they were utterly amazed. He said to them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you to Galilee." So for those of us that were part of the Bible study in the fall when we talked about angels, remember that there seemed to always be a pattern whenever angels became a messenger. It's described over here in the commentary. The young man clothed in white is the interpreting angel. Common feature of apocalyptic writing. The encounter is formulated in a common pattern of angelic messages. The angel appears, the receivers are fearful. The angel tells them not to fear, gives an explanation, and a commission given to the hearers. So we see that exact pattern followed here. Fearful, calm their fears, and told them what had happened, and here's what you're to do. Here's your commission. Then when it gets into the explanation here of the ending being at verse 8, Mark ends his gospel in verse 8. He refrains from describing any resurrection appearances. And then the rationale for assuming that that was the true ending. The vocabulary style of the longer and shorter endings indicate that they were written at a later period by someone other than Mark. The other endings were probably added because of the discomfort felt by later Christians in comparing the abrupt endings of Mark's account with the elaborate resurrection appearances in the other Gospels. In all of the Gospels, there is a direction for the apostles as to where they should go to see Jesus. And here in Mark's gospel, go and tell the disciples and Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. And in Matthew's gospel, we'll move into that. And next week in John's gospel, it's the same thing. Those appearances are in Galilee. But in Luke's gospel, it's Jerusalem. So we'll talk about the significance of why it's Jerusalem in Luke's gospel next week. But Galilee is where Jesus called his apostles, called his followers, where he did all of his teaching and majority of his miracles. showing the disciples what their true mission to carry on was going to be. So the idea of going back to Galilee to see the resurrected Jesus is kind of, okay, I called you to follow me initially, and you followed me through my ministry. Now that I'm going back to the Father, you're to follow me by leading. So carry on what I gave you. And it's now your mission to bring that message to others. It's interesting, though, that the mission that Mary Magdalene and Mary, Mother James and Salome are given is, go tell the disciples, but it ends with, they went out and fled from the tomb, seized with trembling and bewilderment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So with that as the end of the gospel, what does that say?
Well, I think we all have a choice. If we see and believe, we have a choice. Are we gonna be afraid? And that those emotions and trepidations, whatever hangups, or are we gonna get out there and do what we've been commissioned to do as disciples, true disciples? I think that fits into the reason he maybe dropped it off, is because evangelization and discipleship and getting Christ out into the world is meant for each of us as generations. And that's why we try to give it to our kids and our grandkids, because that's the way it's gonna get passed along. But even if we're kind of tentative with our kids or grandkids, they're not gonna get the same necessarily in the world.
Yeah, and it just kind of strikes you that, well, eventually they must have said something to someone, otherwise we wouldn't have this here. We wouldn't
Right.
know. So it makes you, yeah, think that, okay, yep, I felt that fear too, but okay, I need to share, because how will everyone else know?
Well, and really, how will the Holy Spirit work? How will we as individuals change the world if we sit around quiet? And if we are always fearful, and I'm speaking a lot about myself, is the world would never change with the message of Jesus unless we don't get out there as his people.
Now, remember we talked about Mark's gospel and the passion narrative. The point he's trying to make throughout his entire gospel is the role of true disciples and showing what a true disciple is and what true disciples are supposed to do. Most of you are familiar with what Paul Harvey used to do when he would give a detailed background on something and would always end with, and now you know the rest of the story. Well, we know the rest of the story here, but it's more like, instead of now you know the rest of the story, it's now you are the rest of the story. So these are kind of open-ended in that if Jesus is truly going to be known, it's not up to Mary Magdalene to tell us. It's not up to Peter to tell us. It's up to us to tell others.
Yeah, I found that to be curious, and I didn't quite understand, because I understand fear. And fear can cause you to do things you wouldn't think you would be capable of, but something this important, and they told no one. Like say, at some point in time, the message got out. But to make that statement, in this gospel, just seemed very odd to me. So,
Especially right after the vision of that angel telling, it's like, don't just do nothing. It's okay to be afraid, but do something.
well, on the other hand, I mean, it's like overwhelmed. You don't know what to do, but obviously through time, there was a change of heart to some extent, because, like I say, otherwise they never would have gone to Galilee to see the risen Christ. So. Yeah, I can see the people's need to add an ending. So just it just seems so unusual to end it that way. But the interpretation helps.
I think too, sometimes we all have to step back and process what we're being afraid of. What does this mean to us personally? Get a grip of our own emotions before we can share it with others, because then you take on their emotions to when yours are already rocky. And so maybe that was part of it too.
Well, let's look at the endings that got added on. Someone else. So down in verse 10 and 11, she went and told his companions who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. So let's look at where that ending might have come from. So let's go to Luke's Gospel. Chapter 24. And verses 6 to 11.
He is not here, but he has been raised. Remember what he said to you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and rise on the third day. And they remembered his words. Then they returned from the tomb and announced all these things to the 11 and to all the others. The women were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. The others who accompanied them also told this to the apostles, but their story seemed like nonsense, and they did not believe them. 3:11.
Yeah, just so this Gospel of Luke was written probably 10 to 15 years after Mark's Gospel. So Luke actually had Mark as a source in writing his Gospel. So as people then looked later at Mark's Gospel, it's like, okay, can't end there. So they've got this story from Luke that is kind of the basis of those verses 10 and 11 that we got there. Then we go over to and 13. After this, he appeared in another form to two of them walking along on their way to the country. They returned and told the others, but they did not believe them either. Notice there it's got in another form, which very much is what happens back in Luke 24, verses 31 to 35. Yeah.
Twenty-four, 31 to 25.
31 to 35.
35, okay. With that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared in Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he has made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
So that story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus is probably the source for these two verses that were added to the end of Mark's gospel.
So is it possible that this long ending to Mark was rooted in Matthew and or Luke?
Was what?
Rooted in Matthew and or Luke.
Primarily in Luke from what we looked at in these verses,
Okay.
but then in Matthew and the next ones that we're going to look at. Because we talked about in Mark's gospel, the whole message is about discipleship. And discipleship is kind of the commissioning that we're going to get to as we move on to Matthew's gospel. But here in these verses that follow the two that come out of Luke, we probably get these that then come out of Matthew's gospel. He said to them, this is verse 15, "Go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature." And then the ending of the longer ending, verse 20, "But they went forth and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word through accompanying signs." So we can see this longer ending, verse 9 to 20, kind of completes the story. The original ending at verse 8 doesn't, but it's really coming from the other gospels that were written after Mark's gospel. Edited by somebody else, but again, the style, the vocabulary, everything is not like the rest of the gospel, so it's pretty clear that it was not written by the same person.
It's important to know that this ending didn't just come out of nowhere. It came from some other canonical source.
Right.
Anything else on Mark's resurrection story? Let's move on to Matthew then. And in the commentary, it says, aside from certain basic facts, each of the evangelists adds his own peculiar traditions and culminates the unique message of the gospel in the resurrection account. Matthew mentions only two women who came to the tomb. They're the same women who faithfully remained with Jesus at his death and stood watching the tomb at his burial. And then in his gospel says they came to see the tomb, to resume their faithful vigil of mourning. And then it talks about the apocalyptic events that interpret the death of Jesus continue in the resurrection account. The details are characteristic descriptions of the end time in Jewish literature. Remember again that Matthew is writing to Jewish Christians, so they would be familiar with Jewish literature. And through them, Matthew ties the death and resurrection into one great final event. The earthquake proclaims the shaking of the old world to its foundations and the beginning of the new and decisive age of salvation. So an earthquake changes things from what was there prior to the earthquake. So this earthquake that comes about at the time of resurrection, also showing a change in things from what had been to what will now be because of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In verse 7, it says, he has been raised from the dead. And the commentary, it says, Matthew shows that the resurrection is a divine action. So it's that he has been raised, not that he rose, something on his own power, but that he has been raised. So it's the power of God as Father. Again, Jesus is God, but it's not that human nature of Jesus that raises himself from the dead, but it's the divine nature as God
Oh,
that
okay.
raises the human nature.
Oh, sure.
And as Gary mentioned, when we were talking about the gospel for this coming Sunday, the disciples not believing, even though they had been told this is what's going to happen. Here in the commentary, it says, he has been raised just as he said. Each of the passion predictions in Matthew does have that he will be raised. So let's look at each of those. So first of all, 16:21.
From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed on the third day, be raised.
And then chapter 17, verses 21 to 23. Sorry, 22 to 23.
As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were overwhelmed with grief.
And then 17 to 19.
While Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised."
So in all three of these predictions of his death, he says on the third day he will be raised. There is the third day. He was raised just as he said he would be, but do they all believe it or not? Then the commentary talks about the reaction of the women. Fearful, yet overjoyed is the typical and paradoxical reaction to divine manifestations throughout the scriptures. In contrast to the silence and fear of the women in Mark's account, they ran quickly to announce the good news to the disciples. The appearance of the risen Jesus to the women is unique in Matthew, though there are similarities to his appearance to Mary of Magdalene and John. So in Mark and Luke's gospel, there is no appearance to the women by Jesus, but in John's gospel, which we'll look at next week, there's a reference to that. Really great. And then in verse 10, it says, then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid, go tell my brothers to go to Galilee. So again, let's go back where this all started. But referring to them as my brothers. What did his brothers do at the time of his arrest?
They abandoned it.
Deserted him, Peter denying him,
Oh,
but now he's putting them back on good terms, referring to as my brothers. And here's what they're to do, and they'll tell them how they are to carry on. Then we get into something that's unique to Matthew's gospel. So let's go back and look at chapter 27, 62 to 66.
guard at the tomb.
Yep.
The next day, the one following the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that this impostor, while still alive, said, after 3 days, I will be raised up. Give orders then that the grave be secured until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come and steal him and say to the people, he has been raised from the dead. This last impostor would be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, the guard is yours. Go secure it as best you can. So they went and secured the tomb by fixing a seal to the stone and setting the guard.
So what is happening here in verses 11 to 15?
Which chapter is that?
Right here in
Oh.
the resurrection story.
They paid the soldiers and told them to lie because they believed.
And who else did the Jewish leaders pay?
Judas.
So we had exchange of money to Judas to betray Jesus, and then exchange of money to the soldiers to try to make out the resurrection to be a false story. So does money play a role in deceit?
Apparently.
Yes.
Do you want to be free of deceit? Then give me all your money.
Money is the root of all evil.
The love.
So this whole thing with the guards, as we saw in the Passion narrative and here in the resurrection narrative, is unique to Matthew.
Question. The question that came in my mind as I'm reading that is, in the gospel itself, it talks about Jesus telling his apostles that he's going to rise on the third day. How did the priests hear about that? I mean, I'm just thinking that, is that something that was discussed outside their little?
Well, there is the reference to where he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up again.
Okay.
So that's where that would have come from.
Okay, so they understood that metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I needed that.
That is a good question.
Probably the reason that Matthew includes this, and again, Matthew's writing to the Jewish Christians that originally they could remain active in the synagogue as Jews, as well as the domestic church and the breaking of the bread and sharing in Christ's body and blood. But after the Christians were kicked out of the synagogue, there kind of rose this rift between the Jewish Christians and those that remain Jews. So the Jews were putting out this story that this wasn't really the Messiah, this stuff didn't really happen. So that's probably why this story of posting the guards and the guards being paid off to lie about it was added into his gospel, because at the time Matthew was writing, this rift had already, the Jewish Christians had been kicked out of the synagogues, and this rift between Jews and Christians was really beginning to grow. And to show that there was something behind that story.
Is that still present in our current day? That kind of rift or whatever, you know,
No,
I would hope not,
the
but
Jewish, those that are faithful Jews look at Jesus as being a prophet, like the other prophets, but not the Messiah. They're still awaiting the Messiah. And the same with the Islamic religion. They also look at Jesus as a prophet. All three of the great religion, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, believe in the same God. It's only Christians that believe in the Trinitarian God. But the God that we believe in as Catholics is the same God that the Jews believe in, and the same God that the Muslims believe in. They call him Allah, which is the can't remember what language that's written in, but that's their word for God. In fact, if you read, there's more about Mary in the Quran
yeah,
than there is in the Bible.
yeah, she's a significant
Yeah.
person.
They hold her quite high.
Mhm. See that, and then I heard from a priest that those three religions are God's people. Those are the chosen people, the Islamics, the Christians, and the Jewish people, because of Ishmael being Abraham's son and that whole story.
Yeah,
Those are
so,
the three
so
chosen.
the Muslims trace back to Abraham through Islam, Christians and Jews through Isaac. So we all go back to Father Abraham. It's all three.
Thank you for
religions go
clarifying
there. Then we get Jesus appearing to the disciples back in Galilee. And starts, the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. So mountain had been an important part of Jesus' ministry with the disciples. So let's look back at those in Matthew. So first chapter 5, verse 1.
Who was that again?
Chapter 5, verse 1 of Matthew's Gospel.
Oh, okay.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him.
Okay, so the first great teaching of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, on a mountain, and his disciples there. And then chapter 14. 3.
When he had sent them away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray.
And then 15:29.
Moving on from there, Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, went up on the mountain and sat down there.
And then 17:1.
After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves.
So transfiguration also on the mountain. So some significant things that were part of Jesus' ministry with his disciples taking place on the mountain. And again, right in the Jewish Christians, mountains were an important part of their heritage. It's where the burning bush was. It's where the 10 Commandments were given. It's where the flood ended. So a lot of reference throughout the Old Testament to mountains, and a lot here in Matthew's Gospel of the ministry of Jesus. So the appearance on the mountain to the disciples to give them the final commission, again, very much plays in with the message that Jesus is trying, and that Matthew is trying to give throughout his gospel.
Is Jerusalem kind of on a mountain too?
It's on a
City of-
hill.
Okay, so it's going up to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, like from Jericho, when they say going from Jericho up to Jerusalem, you're going up a hill from Jericho.
Okay.
Then we get in this ending here. The commissioning of the disciples, and then verse 16 to 20. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. And they saw him, they worshiped, but they doubted. So let's look at a reference to doubt in 14. One to 31.
(22 to 31).
Yep.
Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?"
So here we have Jesus sending his disciples someplace, and then he's coming to them. Peter, okay, it's you, have me walk on the water to you, and he sees that, oh, I'm not supposed to be able to do this. Don't quite look right here. So even though Jesus had assured him, he began to doubt him, and that's when he began to sink. So here it's the same thing, is disciples are told to go to the mountain. Jesus will meet them there, and they see him, but I know he told us about this resurrection stuff, but it's real or not? So doubt enters into there. But then he commissions them on a worldwide mission. Go therefore make disciples of all nations. And that really is the call of the church, to make disciples of all nations. But then baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Those are the words that we use in baptism. But again, at the time that Matthew's gospel was written, there was no concept of the Trinity. That came about much later. But there are so many things in the Gospels that reference the Trinity, which is really the basis for the later teaching of the Trinity. So let's look back at Jesus' own baptism. We'll go back to chapter 3 of Matthew. And verses 13 to 17.
Say chapter 3.
Chapter 3, 13 to 17.
Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John tried to prevent him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and yet you are coming to me?" Jesus said to him in reply, "Allow it now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." Then he allowed him. After Jesus was baptized, he came up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened for him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming upon him. And a voice came from the heavens saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased."
So what do we see there in Jesus' baptism that implies the Trinity?
God the Father and Jesus, and what was something with the dove.
The Spirit of God.
Yeah.
So in his own baptism, we have what he's now commissioning the disciples to do, go to baptize the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Matthew's gospel, as I indicated earlier, was written after that split between the Jews and the Jewish Christians. So the church itself was really beginning to take on its own identity. It's no longer part of this takes place in the synagogue and part of the domestic church. It's kind of building the structure, the role of the church. So there are some things that are in Matthew's gospel that might not have really occurred historically, but are in his gospel to kind of give credibility to what's developing in the church. And this is one of those, because the church was pretty much taking on the role of the mission would be evangelize, baptize, and teach. As it says here, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. But the role of Peter is another one of those that a lot of scripture scholars say that was added into Matthew's gospel did not take place historically to give credence to the structure that the church was now taking on. So let's look back at commissioning of Peter in chapter 16 of Matthew. Verses 13 to 19.
When Jesus came up to the neighborhood of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples this question: who do the people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptizer, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And you, he said to them, who do you say that I am? You are the Messiah, Peter answered, the Son of the living God. Did you say 17 too?
Through 19.
Okay. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of John. No mere man has revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. I, for my part, declare you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the jaws of death shall not prevail against it. I will entrust to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you declare bound on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you declare loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.
So that's kind of the structure that the church has taken on. Is that Peter, we recognize him as the first pope, is really given authority over the church. And again, scholars say that probably is not something that Jesus actually said, but it's a time that this gospel was written. That was the structure that the church had been taking on. So it's to give credibility to that structure, and that's the role that hierarchical church would follow.
So then, am I understanding you correctly to say that this passage is more of a statement of what was going on in the church and less of a statement, something that Jesus actually said?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
quite, we don't know that for sure,
okay,
but in what scholars are looking at and examining other documents and stuff, that's a lot of what we attribute to Jesus in the Gospels. Some of it is just pure speculation. It's like Jesus went off by himself to pray and said, how do we know what he said when he went out by himself? So they're kind of looking at what would be the context of that prayer. And then this is probably what Jesus said, that we have no way of knowing for sure, since there's nobody there to hear what he was saying.
And if they were there, they fell asleep.
Yeah.
so how is it then how do we know then that is how the church evolved initially with Peter as the authority figure, for want of a better way to put it?
Well, given the role of Peter in Jesus' ministry, he was kind of the leader of the apostles. So he assumed that leadership role. Because when we look at the writings of Paul, which was written before any of the Gospels, he has numerous references to going up to Peter. So he looked at Peter as an authority figure. And again, Paul is writing primarily to the Gentile Christians, not the Jewish Christians.
Yeah.
He was the apostle of the Gentiles. So we look at that universal church. It's kind of, we got Peter, who had been a faithful Jew, but kind of recognized as the leader of the apostles. And we got the Gentiles coming into the church through Paul's ministry. And again, they're looking to Peter as an authority figure. So Peter evolved into an authority figure, and this passage in Matthew was giving credibility to that really was to be his role.
Okay.
So whether Jesus really said that or not, we don't know for sure. But this ecclesial part of Matthew's gospel is consistent with, that was something that was added in the same as this final commissioning here.
It's noteworthy that it was Peter and not someone else that was more someone more equivalent to the disciple that Jesus loved became the initial authority figure in the church. There was somebody as human and frail as Peter.
Yeah, because in particular in John's gospel, where there's really a lot of emphasis to this other disciple. It's like, that's the true believer, that's the true disciple. But Peter assumes he's always secondary to the other disciple in coming to believe, but eventually comes around. So it's kind of showing us that, yeah, we've got doubts, we've got weaknesses, we've got failures, but just like Peter, we can eventually come around. So that other disciple, the beloved disciple, the disciple Jesus loved, is the role for us to try to emulate. But like Peter, it sometimes takes us time to get there.
And so it's therefore okay if it takes us some time to get there too, as long as we,
As long as you get there,
as long as we're seeking,
Yeah. As long as,
as long as we're trying to get there with a sincere heart.
right,
and that's where even we look at deathbed conversions. I mean, you can live your whole life in sin, but if you finally come around at the end, all right, my life was a mess, I really screwed up, but I'm about to meet my maker and I better come to grips with that.
That happened to my father, actually.
Oh, interesting.
you know, I think too, for me, I have no problem believing that Jesus said this to Peter. I mean, that's what we grew up in, everything, but so much of this stuff is personal faith and personal relationship with Jesus, and everybody's striving for that in one way, shape, or form, we hope. But I think it's nice to know that there's that perspective out there, just for that awareness point. But I have no problem believing that Jesus said that to Peter, and that's the way the church was established, the authority and magisterium and the whole shebang. And the gift of infallibility that the Pope has been given is with regards to faith and morals. I think this explains a lot of it right there.
Yeah, and that's the basis for infallibility, which only pertains to dogma. So a pope needs to declare something as dogma in order for it to be infallible. So everything the pope says is not infallible. He has to be proclaiming this as dogma of the church, which is a basic tenet of our belief that if you're going to be Catholic, you have to believe this.
Well, I think this says a lot about how strong this church has stayed for 2,000 years. I mean, we haven't humanly been able to support that. It's the Holy Spirit and God's desire for the church to continue. I mean, it's not humanly possible for our church to continue without God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus and the sacraments.
Yeah, so we're very much a human church.
Exactly.
And we've got some popes that you would not want to emulate. We've got some bishops and priests you would not want to emulate.
Yeah, they're just
We've got
human.
some saints that took a while to come around. Augustine, probably the best example of that.
Mhm.
So it really, Peter is a great example of how you can be human and still be there for what God wants us to be.
Mhm.
That could even be why Peter was chosen and not somebody who was more loyal.
Right.
Yeah, Andrew was probably one of the most royal, because especially in John's gospel, Andrew was the one who was always bringing people to Jesus. I mean, he even brought Peter to Jesus. But that God being with us is really the way this ends, where he says, and behold, I am with you always until the end of the age. So at the beginning of John's gospel, he's got that Jesus is to be named Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So God is with us at the beginning with the birth of Jesus. And now here at the end, as Jesus is about to depart, reminding disciples that he will be with them always, with us in the church always. So let's look back at Daniel and see where early reference, what that's really all about. So Daniel chapter 9, or chapter 7, verses 13 to 18.
Chapter 7.
Yep.
Give me that location again.
Daniel 7, 13 to 18.
Okay. I found it.
As the visions during the night continued, I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. When he reached the Ancient One and was presented before him, he received dominion, glory, and kingship. Nations and peoples of every language serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not be taken away. His kingship shall not be destroyed. I, Daniel, found my spirit anguished within its sheath of flesh, and I was terrified by the visions of my mind. I approached one of those present and asked him what all this meant. In truth, in answer, he made known to me the meaning of the things. These four great beasts stand for 4 kingdoms which shall arise on the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingship to possess it forever and ever.
Of that kingship of God that lasts forever, and Jesus as God telling the disciples that he will be with them and with the church forever. Before we move on to the questions, any final thoughts, insights, comments, questions on either Mark or Matthew's resurrection stories? Insights?
One of the things I realized, the story about the road to Emmaus, I've always liked that. But I realized today that when Jesus appeared to the 2 disciples, they weren't the apostles. I always assumed it was a couple of the apostles, but these 2 disciples went back to the 11 apostles and talked to them. I thought that was striking.
Yeah, and I heard too that it was Clopas and his wife Mary were these people on the road to Emmaus.
Yeah, we'll talk about that next week, but that's what a lot of people feel is to hear about this couple.
And I never heard that before. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, I had heard that it wasn't, some people thought it was a couple.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Always had an assumption built in.
I did too. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing on, especially when we've got the 4 gospels, you kind of hear these stories and you start putting things together that really are from the different sources. And each of the 4 gospel writers had their own perspective, their own theology, their own audience that they were writing to, so the point that they were trying to make. And some things that are common in all, especially the synoptics, where both Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel as the primary source. Sort of brought in, we've got this one book, it's called Gospel Parallels, and the one that I've got takes Matthew's gospel and goes through from beginning to end, but then there's a second column that's got Mark's gospel, and third column's got Luke's gospel that show where they got the same passage. Especially on some of the sayings of Jesus, Mark and Luke, Matthew and Luke may have those sayings, but they put them in a whole different context. So this is something that Jesus said, but when and where did he say it and what was the context? So that's why they feel that Matthew and Luke had Mark as their primary source, but they had this other source that is referred to as Q, and I can't remember the right word, but it's the German word for source. It starts with the letter Q. But it's like if you can buy a book of quotations. So here's a quotation that somebody said, you know, so just a couple sentences, but you have no idea what context was for that quotation. And that's what this source is just here's a bunch of sayings of Jesus, but no context as to when he said it, where he said it, who he addressed it to, or whatever. So Matthew and Luke had that available to them. So they took these known sayings of Jesus and put it where they felt it really fit the story as they were trying to develop it, or the audience that they were trying to address. So that's why this parallel, you see the same passage, but in a whole different context of the different gospels.
That's why this is so good to understand that whole component right there. It's been very good.
Well, let's move on to some of the questions. So question 3, what is the significance of the message the angel commands the women to deliver to Peter and the other disciples?
Well, the angel's telling them that it really was Jesus that was raised from the dead. It wasn't just his body was taken away, and that he's gonna come see you. So the angel's telling them where they need to go next.
It's kind of an announcement, the resurrection.
Is it at the beginning of the commissioning?
Yep.
When it ties into that, don't be afraid, but go out to the whole world.
Called to discipleship. Yeah. Question 5, when we look at the two endings, which of the two endings of Mark's gospel do you prefer? The one that ends at chapter verse 8, or the one that includes 9 to 20? Which do you prefer and why?
I think prior to this discussion today, I would have preferred having the long ending, because just leaving it at 8 feels, very abrupt and like, oh wait, that's the end. But now that we've talked about it and talked about how Mark's gospel is this call to discipleship, I see why it could have just ended at 8, and that it really does strike you. They said nothing to anyone. Well, I don't want to say nothing to anyone, like it can't end there. So I need to be part of that ending of sharing the gospel.
Yeah, it was figuratively, it was literally, it was a new beginning. It wasn't the end. So the transition is missing.
Mhm.
And question 6, how does the reaction of the women in Matthew's gospel at the empty tomb differ from that found in Mark 16:8?
In Matthew, they were filled with joy, and in Mark, they were distressed and terrified.
Well, the second part of that question, how do you think you would have reacted in their place? Be honest.
Well, it's like in anything, you hear and you have this thought, well, I would have done this, but would you really do that? You don't know until you're in that spot.
Well, I'm sure I would have been afraid, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
Mhm.
But hopefully, but yeah.
How can you not be afraid though?
Yeah.
When they witnessed what he went through during his crucifixion, and then that uncertainty is still going to follow them, and everything is new, and even though they're told they still were going to be afraid because that's all part of it. That uncertainty is there. So, yeah, the fear. I know I'd be afraid.
Yeah, me too.
But in Matthew's gospel, it acknowledges their fear, but that there was this joy too, and that they, even though they were afraid, they still took the
Yeah.
action. Like, you hope that would be your reaction to that. You'd feel the fear, but you still would be driven to go do what the angel told you to do.
It's kind of like in today's world, when you got this sense that you'd like to say something about Jesus to somebody that you have a sense that they don't even know who he is. It's like, okay, do I say that? How do I say it? When do I say it? How are they going to receive it? All this swirl of, and then it kind of stops you from acting.
Yeah, sometimes it takes real courage to speak your faith openly. There's some people you're very comfortable doing that with other ones, it's like, I'm not sure I want to do that.
I appreciate the peace, so I'm gonna stay here.
Question 8, what might the interaction between the risen Jesus and the women returning from his tomb suggest about the body of the risen Jesus and their understanding of who he is?
Can you say that over again?
What might the interaction between the risen Jesus and the women returning from his tomb suggest about the body of the risen Jesus and their understanding of who he is?
Well, his body was a real human body, not just some divine presence in a human appearance. Jesus had proven his divinity, but remained a living human person.
So what did they actually do?
They took hold of his actual body.
And
They
embrace
took hold of his feet.
Mm.
And then they worshiped him, so they had to recognize that this was Jesus.
In question 9, the reaction of the disciples when they encounter the risen Jesus in Galilee is an interesting mixture of faith and doubt. How is their reaction reflected in your own faith life?
I can't remember what the actual reference is, but I think of the verse a lot that where it says, I believe, help my unbelief. And I feel like that applies to my life so many times that I believe, Lord, I want to do this, but I recognize that I have this unbelief in me, and help me through that.
Yeah, faith is belief. It's not necessarily knowledge as we understand it, and it's in what we consider the real world, the physical world. So that there's always that, for me anyway, that dichotomy, this is what I know, this is what I believe.
Mhm.
And sometimes what I see, I really wonder how that can happen. It's probably because I don't have the full understanding of what the world is. I only know what I can see and touch and feel. So there's a piece of it that's missing that I have to work on.
And I think God made it that way, that there just are things that you never are going to understand until you're with him.
That's why you have free will. You get to make some choices.
Yeah.
And hopefully they're valid choices.
But I think fear and doubt are just gonna be a personal struggle my whole life, and the point, like you were saying, is we just have to press on and keep seeking and persevering and not letting those emotions stop us from acting and from seeking and trying to understand, okay, where's this doubt coming from and what's Jesus telling me and all that kind of stuff. And what I've seen him do in the past in my life, to reflect on those areas of doubt that he soothed or whatever happened.
I guess I can say that in my own life, I've seen God working in my life in some parts of my life, and then seemingly not working in others. And for many years, I would ask, okay, what God, why have you taken care of this, this, and this, but not this?
Mhm.
And it's only been in recent years that I've been realizing he is taking care of this, not this thing. It's just taking me some time to realize that.
It's different than what you expected
Yeah.
or wanted.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And in just about all those cases, I've realized he was right all along.
Just about. You're getting there.
That's really true, though.
That it is.
Mhm.
Question 10. What way does the commissioning of the disciples in Matthew's gospel set the tone for the life of the church for all ages to come?
Yeah, what I pulled out of it is the mission is to baptize, evangelize, and to teach all the people of all the nations. So it's a kind of a universal Catholic type of acclamation. Did I use Catholic, right?
The little C, not big C.
Exactly.
So I didn't know what the answer was to number 7. I didn't quite, I didn't be able to grasp anything to write down on that one.
Well, those were the passages that we looked at,
Mhm.
reference to the mountain.
Oh, those, okay. Okay.
Skip that question. Some of the questions that are in here are things that.
Okay. Thank you.
You're writing so
Oh, thank you.
so nice.
Oh my gosh, it is. Thanks.
Any final thoughts? Questions, comments, insights?
Do you need something, Shirley?
Well, we have discussed the last 5 sessions with 4 sessions on passion and 2 gospels on resurrection. hopefully that will make these next few days of the Triduum a little bit more meaningful for you to understand a little bit more of what's behind those Gospels as we hear them proclaimed. It's Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil, and Easter Sunday. And throughout the Easter season, emphasizes the acts of the apostles and the call to discipleship and what the early church did. So again, next week, our evening session will be Monday night and morning session Tuesday morning. Hope that you all have a wonderful Holy Week. Blessed Easter.
You too.
Yeah, you too. Thank you for
And
everything.
one thing I should bring up here. We have the Holy Thursday service. We end that with a procession to the Eucharistic chapel that will be set up in the hospitality room. And we have adoration all night from the time that ends about roughly 8:30 until morning prayer at 9:30 Friday morning. So if you want to go to our parish website, it says first Friday of the month, you just click on that, it takes you to this sign up sheet. So several time slots to fill in here. Spend an hour or more or less, especially during the night. Some of these earlier late night times still open.
And is the church's main entrance where you come in at?
Yeah, that's just go to the front doors and then down the hallway to the hospitality. Okay, so let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Thank you.
all of you.